talk about let's talk about open skies policy for a while, and get your views on whether you think it's an effective way to develop. You mentioned earlier transportation policy, and I certainly agree that we need to have an integrated transportation policy. But since we are talking about aviation, open skies, what kind of role should it play? Are we giving up more, or are we really
Well,
winning?
we should, I mean, you should know that I am an unabashed mercantilist. So I think the United States, in all of its trade negotiations with others, should be careful to protect its own interests and the interests of its own citizens. Now, the whole notion of open skies in aviation has been a joke for a long time. The United States government would go out and negotiate a treaty with Japan, which would give U.S. airlines 10 landing rights, the right to operate 10 flights to Japan, and Japanese airlines 10 flights to operate to the United States. The Japanese would promptly take advantage of that opportunity and launch 10 flights. The United States went through a process of deciding which airline was going to get those rights. That took a couple of years. After it decided which airlines would get those rights, the individual airlines would go to the Japanese government only to learn that, yes, they had the right, but there was no place to land, because a recalcitrant potato farmer continued to raise potatoes, right, in the middle of the primary airport at Tokyo. But 5 or 6 years from now, I'm sure we'll be able to induce the potato farmer to give that up, and then maybe we'll be able to give you the right that your country negotiated for. And this goes on across the world. It goes on in France. In France, there's a downtown airport, Orly. American was operating in the 1980s and 1990s very successful international flights to Orly. Suddenly, the French government decided that this was very bad for public health, that we couldn't have long-haul flights from Orly, that everybody had to move to Charles de Gaulle. As it turns out, the only gates available at Charles de Gaulle were way out at the end. It's very inconvenient, right? And so American, under duress, when Felix Royatin was the ambassador to Paris, was forced to give up its operation, where we were clobbering Air France, because we were carrying a large majority of the high-end business, the first class and business class, because Orly was much more convenient than Charles de Gaulle. We were forced to move to de Gaulle. Most recently, the French government has decided, gee, it's really okay to operate internationally out of Orly, and has now decided to let a French low-cost international airline operate international flights out of Orly. I think they failed, but nonetheless, they were granted the right to do it.
I hear you.
Now, the fact of the matter is, all of these international points, their governments talk about open skies. They don't want open skies. What they want is access for their own carriers to the largest aviation market in the world up to this point, which is the United States. And at the same time, they use a whole array of controls of one kind and another. Either slot controls, gate availability, ground handling services, a variety of other things to prevent U.S. airlines from using the size and power of U.S. hubs to operate as much frequency as would be required to exercise international dominance. Now, all of this, if you go back to the late 1980s and the early 1990s, Air France was on the brink of failure. Lufthansa was on the brink of failure. BA was in bad shape. The then Chancellor of Germany, who was then Kohl, came over and had lunch with Bill Clinton. And Clinton allowed Lufthansa to make an arrangement with United, by which Lufthansa now can advertise that it flies to Des Moines and Dubuque and thousands and hundreds of other places west of Chicago. They don't really do that, but they put their code on flights that United operates, right, beyond Chicago. So Lufthansa can go off into Eastern Europe, to Warsaw, and advertise, go all the way to Des Moines on Lufthansa. And that's what they do. United can do the same thing, so it can operate from Des Moines, say, to Warsaw. But no other airline that wants to fly through Frankfurt to Eastern Europe can do so because Lufthansa won't give them any seats, and they won't code share with them. So effectively, the President of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany established a cartel to the great benefit of Lufthansa. Now, if you look at Lufthansa's circumstance in the early 1990s, where they were on the verge of bankruptcy, and Lufthansa today was probably the most prosperous airline in the world, and United, which at that time was a very strong carrier, and today is a shadow of its former self, and ask yourself whether the U.S. government has adopted wise policy. This is nonsense. We are beggaring ourselves in the name of open skies. For the benefit of who?
That's a very interesting comment, and if I may, now that
Because you were there.
you provoked the question, I will give you some additional thoughts.
Right.
I was the country director for the State Department for Germany at that time. We had just gone through unification of Germany. The Germans felt very close to us. We were very close to them. President H.W. Bush began a negotiation on code sharing. Matthias Wissmann was the Minister of the Transportation Minister, if you will. And you're right to say that they were looking for that kind of connection. And politically, there was a policy that transformed both from H.W. Bush to Clinton. That was, how do we deepen that relationship? Because we weren't sure how Germany was going politically, so we did have a political agenda. We wanted to make sure that Germany felt connected to us, not only connected to the EU, and not only neighbors to Russia. So there was a political agenda, certainly behind the question. But I remember in the discussion that it wasn't all that easy. It wasn't just the discussions that H.W. Bush had before the election and then later when Clinton got together with Chancellor Kohl, but there was a whole debate about antitrust. And in that antitrust discussion, American Airlines was a very critical negotiator. There were, if I remember correctly, 7 legacy carriers. Each of them had a part in this debate, and the debates focused on antitrust issues and business issues. So on the antitrust issues, I'd be delighted to hear your views on that. But on the business issues, if I remember correctly, United Airlines, in a letter signed by the CEO at that time, took a very strong business position. And that strong business position was it would be unfair to have this kind of code sharing with those 2 airlines unless there were other things for the other airlines, in particular for American Airlines landing rights in Heathrow. 4 slots was a discussion, and I would be very interested to know if my recollection is correct, and what the business impact of
Well, your
those
recollection
sports.
is absolutely right. And to this day, the U.S. government has never been willing to approve the agreement between British Airways and American, which was meant to mirror the agreement between Lufthansa and United.
I see
To
that.
this day.
I see it, but it's under consideration, I understand.
Baloney sausage. It's never going to happen. It's been under consideration since 1997.
Right,
I negotiated it.
right.
Right, as an outgrowth of the agreement between Lufthansa and United, which we opposed.
Right. Very
Fiercely opposed.
effectively,
Yeah.
because
Well,
that
we
began
didn't.
in
we, no, we weren't
1992.
very effective because it worked.
But
It worked for Lufthansa, and it has never worked for BA
Right.
and for American.
That was a very interesting debate because it started in 92 and 97 before was actually, we were actually effective in promoting and delaying the process, but it's very interesting, I think, in terms of what is the policy implication? Where are we?
And the policy implication is that, look, it's bad policy. It is bad, and it reflects the fact that people in the government, right, probably including you when you were there,
Right.
don't understand how the business works. Nobody else can fly to Frankfurt. if you don't have seats beyond Frankfurt so that you can offer online transportation into Eastern Europe through Germany, because you can't fly nonstop to Eastern Europe because the cities aren't big enough.
In those early years after unification, Delta, the fight was over Pan Am's inter-German service routes, because those were...
All of which have gone away.
All of which have gone
all
away.
of which went away. They all failed. That's the reason I didn't want them. I knew they were going to fail.
Right.
And the fact is, all we needed to say to the Germans and the French was no.
Right.
You can feel close to us. Our airlines will fly often to your cities.
Fair enough. And you're right, certainly, and from our side at the State Department, we're not experts in the industry, and it's more than fair to say that the political issues were very heavily considered.
And that's true, but you see, and herein lies the problem. It doesn't relate much to you or to me. The problem is that if you look at what has happened, right, the European airlines have prospered, the American airlines, the U.S. airlines have failed.
Right.
All the major U.S. airlines have been through bankruptcy, right? And the outgrowth of this whole notion of open skies and spreading more competition around the world has simply been to beggar the United States, cost the United States jobs, cost the United States the ability of its airlines to earn international profits and thus sustain the domestic system. Right? And it's had a broadly negative impact on the United States of America. This is not why we have a government.
So in the debate about priorities, there is the political part. In this case, as I said earlier, Pan Am, symbol of freedom and mobility of a government, that the basic premise of transportation is a critical element of our country.
Right.
Then the questions of deregulation that we talked about it's all about price and not about the other elements. So in the Open Skies Agreement, you suggest that we are continuing that debate.
In the open sky, I have never understood why the United States wants to promote open skies, since unlimited, unrestricted competition in international markets is never going to work. It hasn't worked, and it will not work, because there are too many restrictions on the other side, and it all depends on hub connections on both sides of the overwater linkage. So long as the Europeans, as they have, very effectively control and limit U.S. access, and at the same time have the ability to draw into their own systems revenues, right, which are derivative of the U.S. domestic market, then what you've got going on today is just going to continue. And now there are people out there that want to let international airlines buy, right, a majority interest in U.S. carriers. Now I'll ask you a question. Since nobody has ever made any money in U.S. domestic aviation, right, since the industry has lost $35 billion since Orville and Wilbur first flew, why do you suppose an international airline would want to own a domestic U.S. carrier? Do you suppose it's because they have a sense of duty to America, that they're going to provide service to small cities or jobs for American workers? I don't think so. All they want to do is drain out of the U.S. domestic airline system the international traffic which they can carry profitably. And the devil take the hindmost.
So that goes back to your earlier comment that I may like to quote about here. It says, we have seen no indication of a Department of Transportation and the Department of Transportation a robust, intellectually defensible economic analysis of prospective bilateral transactions.
Absolutely.
So,
there just isn't one, and there never has been one.
and so how do we get this debate about transportation policy and aviation policy started?
I think people in the United States sooner or later, people in the United States have got to say, wait a minute. I look around the world, right? I see every other country in the world has got a much more integrated transportation system than we have. Why is it that when I go to Singapore, I see much better facilities than I see at any U.S. airline terminal? Right? Why is it, right, when I fly to Shanghai, right, I get much better facilities in Shanghai than I've got at any U.S. entry point? Why is that? It's because my government's incompetent, so I better have a new government. So let's throw the rascals out and see if we can't get somebody better in there.
We just did that, I think. So,
Yeah, I think so.
so maybe there's
And
an opportunity
And
with this.
so far, the progress is not very, very encouraging.
So I take it that you would defend the tight restrictions on foreign ownership.
Absolutely.
And you and Jim Overstar have seemingly very similar points of view on.
Overstar seems to have reached the same conclusions, although I've never seen much of an explanation as to why he believes that. But the fact is, since he agrees with me, I think he's a great man.
Well, that's only appropriate. It is probably true.
Who knows? Fact is, yes, Overstar has expressed those concerns, and I think they are well founded. The fact of the matter is, there's no intellectually defensible reason why. The U.S., despite the current capital crunch, you don't go elsewhere to raise capital. You come to the U.S. This is where the capital markets are deepest and richest. So if we ever get out of this recession, they'll be deep and rich again. So you don't go elsewhere to raise capital. You come here. So if an airline or any other business is a decent business, it can raise the capital it needs here. So there must be some other explanation for why international airlines would want to buy domestic airlines, and there is. They simply want to drain the traffic that might otherwise be carried by U.S. carriers onto their own system.
Right. In 2006, we had this nice conference here that that Brian and the Chicago Council put on, and one of the issues that came out of that was indeed the question that you're raising. So where do we go?
Well, again, where do we go? I am afraid that where we're going is we're simply going to keep doing what we've been doing so far, because I haven't seen any indication from the new administration or the new Secretary of Transportation that anybody is trying to formulate either a completely integrated transportation policy or a reformulated aviation transportation policy. Unless we change, unless we articulate different objectives, and unless we behave differently than we have behaved in the past, nothing's going to change.
But if we go back to the question of capital, raising capital, in this conference that we had 2 years ago, the U.S. carriers said they needed capital. This is before the crash, before the Great Recession.
They do need capital.
And
the U.S. carriers are not. The role of somebody who's running a company isn't to formulate sensible public policy.
Right.
It is to preserve the company.
right,
So the fact of the matter is, right, if an airline needs capital, and if some foreign airline is willing to provide that capital, and if domestic markets are not willing to provide that capital, the person who's running the company is going to say, sure,
right.
please change the law so I can let my current good friend Gustav, or whatever his name is, provide the capital, even though, right, that may have a deleterious effect on U.S. transportation. That's not my problem. My problem is to preserve my company.
And that's the debate that we have around Overstar's proposal right now. Is the U.S. industry in a position to raise capital here?
Look, it really doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. I'm not prepared to let the U.S. industry sell itself to foreign ownership, right, whether it can raise domestic capital or not. Mm-hmm. I think the bottom line is, right, that the airplanes aren't going to go away. So if in an apocalypse, right, every airline went bankrupt again, every airline would reorganize and the airplanes would still be flown. They'd just simply devolve the service levels down to the lowest possible standard. So we'd meet the U.S. objective of having the lowest possible prices, even if it's the worst possible service, right? And maybe they'd make some money again.
So that opens a whole nother discussion, and that's about mergers and consolidation, the bankruptcies, bankruptcy, if you're in bankruptcy, unlike the strikes that you talked about in the last hour where there was a profit-sharing process, if you're in bankruptcy and you can still operate, but you don't have to pay all your costs, you can operate at a competitive advantage.
That's exactly right. And that is one of the things that has happened. It is another of the pernicious effects that U.S. policy has had on the business. People go bankrupt, but they don't go away.
Right.
Instead of going away, instead of being forced to liquidate, right, they're allowed to emerge from bankruptcy with lower costs, and they come out here and they charge lower fares. Because remember, I said during any period of failure, you lose business before, you lose business during, and you lose business after. Now they don't have as much business as they had before, so they come out of bankruptcy and they use those lower costs to charge lower fares to attract patronage. That drives everybody down to that new low fare level, right, which has the effect of driving the next carrier into bankruptcy, which is exactly what's happened. And Continental's been bankrupt twice.
Right.
And the first time, when Frank Lorenzo did, everybody said nobody will fly on a bankrupt carrier. Well, it turned out to be wrong. He got up the next morning and he published much lower fares, and everybody said, hooray, let's go out and get on the airplane. So the fact of the matter is, what among other things, and we've forced everybody down. Everybody that hasn't been able to sustain costs went through bankruptcy, shed some of their costs, and has come out. And every major carrier, with the exception of American, has been through bankruptcy. And American now has the highest costs among all the legacy carriers as a byproduct of the fact that it has declined or has so far been able to avoid bankruptcy. I mean, this is not a way to run a business.
So
United built a huge new maintenance base outside Indianapolis. And as a byproduct of its bankruptcy, that whole maintenance base is now closed. And all that work is done overseas, much of it in China. Where United flies its airplanes for heavy maintenance into shops where most people don't speak English, and the FAA never goes. Now, is this sensible public policy? All in the name of the lowest possible fares. No, I don't think it's sensible public policy. That's the issue. You see, I mean, if you want the lowest possible fares, then we're doing the right thing. If you want to preserve jobs in the United States, if you want to preserve some semblance of a reasonably capable industry, if you want to sustain the United States' role in international aviation, you've got to do something different.
So we've been doing something different with the price in particular, with low-cost airlines and legacy airlines. Mm-hmm. Is that the future?
I'm afraid so. Look, unless public policy articulates something different, it seems pretty clear that the public is going to follow its instincts to always buy the cheapest fare. You see, airlines have little actual continuing relationship with customers. If you go out and you buy, because I don't want to get into naming airlines, but let's suppose you go out and you buy, new entrant airline A. This particular airline only has, you know what pitch is? It's the distance from any point on this seat to the same point on this seat. Right. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, coach pitch is about 32 inches, but there are airlines out there flying at 28. So, and then when you go on one of those 28-inch pitch airlines, they dip you in bear grease before you get on so you can slip into the seat. So you go and you get on the airplane and you get, you have just a really miserable experience. The flight attendant's very unpleasant, and you get cricks in your legs for 3 days thereafter. But the next time you need to take a trip, because it's the cheapest seat, you buy it again. And that's what the public does. As long as the public does that, and as long as we have no sort of countervailing public policy, that's what we're going to get. So what's happening now? We're consolidating. Mm-hmm. The legacy airlines are gradually consolidating. Now, one of the rules of life, I'm sure you'd agree, is if you want really good service, right, turn everything over to one company. They're very likely to provide really great service, right? Instead of having 7 different competitors, just have one, without any government oversight. You think you got bad service now? Wait till you see what's coming. Consolidation doesn't make any sense. Why do you want to have one person making all the decisions instead of 7 or 10 or 12 or 15 competitors? You're much better off to have a competitive matrix of companies, right, with some form of regulation to control what those companies do so that they deliver a product which is consistent with the public interest. It's just like utility regulation. Right? You don't, did you read, I don't know whether you happen to read. If you haven't read it, you should. An article in Sunday's New York Times about water quality in America.
Yes.
We don't, we got lots of communities across the United States, right, that no longer have safe water.
Exactly.
Right? Because we have taken away the regulatory capability. Right? That's supposed to go out and inspect water plants. In Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I live, we just had to boil our water for 3 weeks.
That's
pretty extreme.
That's pretty.
Same outcome, however. The fact is we've taken apart the regulatory apparatus. We're talking here about aviation. Same things happened in water, same things happened in food supply, same things happened with power generation. We've taken away the regulatory apparatus, and by taking away the regulatory apparatus, we've lost the ability to control what happens to the public. And we have lost our ability to decide what we think proper public policy is.
The argument is compelling, but it doesn't seem to have won the day.
No, it doesn't. I quite agree with you.
Why doesn't it win?
Because it's socialist.
Yeah.
It's like socialized medicine. People go to town hall meetings and they stand up. They're on Medicare now, just as I'm on Medicare. I've been on Medicare for since I was 65. It was a long time ago now. Medicare really works. It doesn't have anything to do with which doctor I select. It has nothing to do with which hospital I go to. Right? But it pays the bills, and it delivers darn good service. So you have people stand up at these meetings and say, keep your hands off my Medicare, no socialized medicine. Hey, what? Say what again? Medicare is socialized medicine. Now, why hasn't regulation carried the day? Because we have an ideological notion introduced in the late 70s and early 80s in the form of Reaganism that government is the problem. Government's not the answer. The United States public has bought into that very generally. And so long as we believe that government is always a problem and never the answer, we're going to have the kinds of problems we're talking about.
It's interesting that you draw the analogy to the healthcare debate, because that is a question for our political debate right now. It's about the airlines, and the airlines are in difficult times, extremely difficult times. Solutions have been put on the table for open skies, for bilaterals, improving bilaterals, for antitrust immunity, all kinds of very important issues that rely on the basic concept that we can have a role for government. So
No. J.D., unless you're reading different newspapers or keeping up with a different industry than I am, I haven't heard any solution proposed which introduces more government. All of the solutions proposed propose still further relaxation of regulation, more open skies. Let ownership of U.S. carriers pass into international hands. Right. By all means, don't impose FAA inspections on foreign repair stations, because that might offend some of our good allies. We're continuing to do the same things we have done. So what we've got today is the outcome. Today's circumstance of the U.S. airline industry is a circumstance of the policies that have been enforced since 1978, all through the 80s and the 90s, and the first 10 years, 30 years. This is the outcome. And the proposals are to do still more of it.
except for your voice. And your voice is interesting to see the debate between you and Professor Levine, for instance. If you'd be interested to have you characterize and comment on that because it is the philosophical point about how government should intervene or what kind of regulation should have, and his position still that we really can't do that yet. So I'd be very.
Well, I don't know why you can't. You see, I mean, it seems to me it's kind of witch doctor economics. And the fact of the matter is, we've tried it that way.
Right.
This is the outcome. Do we like the outcome? Some people may like the outcome. I don't like the outcome. Right. I think what we have done is emasculate the U.S. aviation industry, right, which I think has in the short run and will in the longer term and the future disadvantage the United States and thereby all of its citizens. So I don't like the outcome, and I think we ought to reimpose some reasonable level of regulation. Michael Levine simply doesn't believe in that notion. He believes that the market should be completely free to do whatever it wants to do at all times. Right? So, I mean, we've got an interesting hearing coming up next week in Washington. There's groups of people that want to prohibit the airlines from keeping people on airplanes for more than 3 hours at a time.
This is an interesting twist on the debate, passenger rights.
Exactly.
Where are we? I'm not aside from those who were stranded at the airport because they couldn't get permission to go in the building, but there's a whole debate, and certainly in Europe, there's a movement for it.
In Europe, the rule generally is 1 hour.
Right.
And in Europe, generally, an airplane doesn't leave the gate until it has a takeoff slot. In this country, we push them off and line them up. And then we blow kerosene out the back, for which we buy petroleum from people that want to kill us. Right? And, I mean, does this make sense? No. I think it makes a lot more sense to say, wait a minute, you can't fly that many trips to LaGuardia. Right? What we're going to do is we're going to reduce the number of available slots by 25% from where it is today. You can use bigger airplanes if you want to. In fact, we're going to require you to use bigger airplanes. But we are not going to permit runway delays. You don't leave the gate till you got a takeoff slot. That means you have to cut down the number of frequencies. That means that if you live in, some little town, you can't fly to LaGuardia. Sorry about that.
But your counterparts are arguing that it should be a decision of the airline, not the decision of the government.
Well, then let them make it. We have waited 30 years for the airlines to make those decisions. They're never going to make them, J.D.
And that's why we're having this.
No airline is ever going to reduce frequency at LaGuardia. It doesn't care if its airplanes are delayed.
It doesn't care about passenger rights either.
It doesn't care. I know. But the point is that let's suppose, we all know we've got too many airplanes scheduled at LaGuardia.
Right.
If I take an airplane out, United will promptly put one in. So what's the outcome? The outcome is United gains market share. Because people don't buy tickets based on whether Airline A or Airline B or Airline C sit on the runway. We all sit on the runway. Because the FAA has no interest in allocating. If I only fly 10 flights a day, one in each hour, the FAA won't let me take off first. They're going to put me in a line right behind the guy that operates 50 flights in each hour. So there's no advantage to drawing down capacity. This is one of many cases. Individual companies can't do that in a shared facility.
You're arguing also that there's no brand loyalty and that the price really does govern the decisions of the passengers.
That's right.
And so that in order to have service and frequency.
So you got to match the price,
right?
And you got to have comparable frequency. If United has 12 flights from Chicago to LaGuardia, American has 12.
Right.
United adds one, American adds one.
I know, I switched between the two. I didn't say that, but yeah.
I know you switch between the two. Who's going next? Martha, who's got the next flight out of LaGuardia? This is not brand loyalty.
It's not brand loyalty.
When we invented frequent flyers, the invented frequent flyer plan, we announced the Advantage program, and it had a lot of, you saved, you didn't have to clip coupons or anything. We kept all the records for you on Sabre. But it had a very important requirement, and that is you could accumulate miles during a calendar year. But at the end of that year, you started a new accumulation, and so you couldn't combine them. That lasted 2 days. When TWA matched it, you had to clip coupons and so forth, but they said you can accumulate miles forever. So immediately, the central proposition, the central driver of brand loyalty, which is that in order to accumulate the most miles in a limited period, you have to stick with one airline, went away. Poof.
So I have 5 cards now.
Exactly. You're in every. You're in every.
I'm loyal
program.
to everybody.
So am I.
Yeah. That doesn't really work, does it? So it's absolutely fascinating to see how this works. But is there a future for legacy carriers, or are we?
Sure, there's a future for legacy carriers. They're simply going to continue to grind down their cost. They have to grind down their cost. Eventually, they're going to run out of money. So if they can't get their costs down low enough, they'll go bankrupt again.
Right. Repeatedly.
They'll
And that's a
just-
cycle.
They'll go as many times as they have to go, and they'll get their costs down, right, to whatever level is required to compete with whoever is offering the lowest price in the marketplace.
And
And they'll continue to withdraw service. From this year, in 2009, about 100 U.S. cities have lost all scheduled air transportation. Right? And lots of those who now have it, as a matter of fact, your colleague was commenting to me this morning, you can no longer fly between Chicago and Montreal except on an RJ. Right? Now, so instead of operating a few relatively efficient airplanes, right, the airlines operate lots of inefficient airplanes, thereby burning the maximum amount of jet fuel. That doesn't sound like a very sensible sort of public policy position from a country that needs to free itself from buying other people's petroleum.
right.
But we make no effort to assure the most efficient use of petroleum products as transportation fuels. We don't even try. We let people fly little airplanes around in increasing frequency rather than insisting that scarce resources be used in the most efficient way.
And so you paint the picture of fewer routes, less frequency, poorer service, bankruptcies. This is not a very uplifting picture of the
No, it's
future.
not. No, it's not. I agree with that. I have a very hard time finding anything to be cheerful about. It's not an encouraging picture, but once again, I simply make the point. That's what's happened so far, and that's what's going to continue to happen unless we have amended different public policies.
Right. And the prospects for this debate, you're having a hearing next week?
Well, next week, the discussion next week is about passenger rights.
Right.
And, you know, there are lots of unintended consequences of carelessly applied rules. But the reality is, I think we have got to get past the notion that we can keep people locked on airplanes for 4 or 5, 6 hours at a time.
Yeah.
You just can't do that. You're going to have to find a way to let them off, which means that the airlines are going to have to change some of their operating characteristics, but the FAA is going to have to change as well. When an airplane pulls out of the conga line and goes back to the gate, it loses its takeoff position. It doesn't have to. The FAA could assign it an accelerated takeoff position, go back to the gate, let people off, and then we're going to let that airplane take off before the airplanes that were behind it. But the question, of course, is there another taxiway? So, I mean, there are lots of physical constraints, but there are also a lot of policy constraints. Okay, I mean, we had, you know, this whole notion that an airplane gets diverted and it lands, it's coming into a place without customs. So what? Let the people off. What are we worried about? 3 guys from Turkey that happen to be wandering around the United States? We don't keep track of them anyway. Right? Congress passed a law 11 years ago requiring the U.S. government to keep track of everybody in the country by visa number. They haven't done it yet. So why are we worried about letting some guy off an airplane who might sneak away without showing his passport to a customs official. It's just utter nonsense. We'll keep him locked up on an airplane. It's just plain silly. So the FAA has got in. The last time I had an extended tarmac delay was because Joe Biden's airplane was in the airspace. I said, Joe, go back to Washington.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't lock up the airspace every time you fly. And don't sit on the ground talking to people, all right, while you got a whole conga line of airplanes out here sitting there that can't take off because of the rules that say we can't be up in the air with the president and the vice president at the same time. So you got customs, you got FAA, you got the unions, you got the airlines themselves, you got airports. All of these people have got to work together if we're going to avoid the problem. But the fact is, I think the time has come to make those changes. I don't think we can keep people involuntarily contained in airplanes for 4 and 5 and 6 hours at a crack.
Absolutely. And related to that is getting in and out of the airport, or at least into the airport. What have you seen in change in management operations since 9/11 and all of the airport security changes? And it's not just in the United States, it's also internationally. What has that done to the businesses?
Well, I think everybody's gotten used to it, JD, to tell you the truth. I mean, traveling by air is nowhere near as pleasant as it once was. And we continue to go through this nonsensical business of taking off shoes, right, and carrying fluids around in little bottles. You know, I mean, it's foolishness, but it's because nobody is prepared to balance risk against convenience. And I must say, Americans are becoming enormously quiescent. You stand in these long security lines and you hear people say, oh, I'm so glad they're looking at everything. It makes me feel safe.
Yes.
Doesn't make me feel safe, it just makes me feel irritated. But, you know, if people are that, so people are gonna, the industry will go where the public takes it. If it takes it to the lowest possible fares, as long as the public is prepared to tolerate the kind of nonsense that TSA is doing. You know what TSA stands for? Thousands standing around.
I think that's trillion. No, it's very, very hard. Travel has been very difficult, and the things that we've been talking about don't seem to address other issues other than price. And you keep coming back to the issue of price, and there are more issues that need to be addressed. And certainly, if you travel internationally, you can still find elements of these other issues of frequency of availability or alternatives. Or rail is from an airport to rail. You can find pleasant passenger service on board. You can find good connections. So it isn't that airlines can't produce.
But they are all the consequence. Right? They're all the consequence of different public policy choices. There's no rail system in the world that makes money. They lose money. But the governments, because they want transportation alternatives, right, tax their citizens and invest in, I mean, our highway system doesn't make money. We invest lots of money in it. And of course, it pays handsome dividends in terms of the vitality that it brings to the economy. That's the same argument for a vital air transportation system or a vital system of rail, as the case may be, the movement of freight. It is, I mean, but you get those outcomes with different public policy choices.
And so we have an International Aviation Law Institute here, and this kind of conversation helps shape the way that we can bring these issues to our students, but also gives us an opportunity to promote public policy. So if you're talking about this school and all the other law schools of the world, what should lawyers be thinking about? What should they be dealing with, since much of what you're talking about engages not only the regulation, deregulation, but the whole range of legal services that go with it?
Well, I don't know. I guess, I mean, I don't know. You know, there are many who say, as I'm sure you guys know, that the world is overpopulated with lawyers. I don't know that there is any particular role for lawyers or the law. This is not a legal issue. Obviously, when you start to draft documents, you've got to be sure they are drafted in conformance with alternative statutes in the United States or where they may be. But this is not fundamentally a problem of formulating a legal position. This is a matter of formulating a transportation strategy. This is how do we believe that transportation is a vital part of the U.S. economy? Do we or don't we? If we do we think that transportation is in any way interrelated to our government's energy policy? Well, if we think the answer to that is yes, then we say, well, we need a transportation policy that's going to allow people to move around as freely and as inexpensively as possible. We need an energy policy that's going to minimize energy use. So how do we do that? How do we make better use? How do we drive cars off the road? How do we provide the best alternatives, whether it's buses or trucks, right, or high-speed rail or low-speed rail? And how do we use the resources we've already got most effectively? Well, we've got a great system of highways. The problem is it's plugged up with way too many cars. But this becomes, I mean, there has never been, there really hasn't ever been that I have witnessed or been aware of, a serious debate in the United States about the imposition of a gas tax. I mean, it gets mentioned in passing, and some politician rises up and denounces it as something that he'd never voted for. The fact of the matter is, until we have a gasoline tax, a substantial gasoline tax in the United States, we are not going to moderate the use of private cars. But the public, right, has no interest in the matter. Now, why doesn't the public have an interest in that? You guys tell me. You run this big law school. All right, we're going to have a $20 trillion national debt by the year 2019. The annual debt service on that is going to be between $600 and $800 billion, just the debt service. Right? It's going to bankrupt your grandkids and mine, and the public doesn't care. Now, if you explain that to me, there's something for lawyers to think about. Right? Can we make it illegal for politicians to lie?
That would be charged, wouldn't it? I don't know who would be enforcing that, though.
I don't know. I mean, you say what's going to happen to the transportation system, the aviation system. I think it's going to continue to deteriorate. But all the other things we're touching on here kind of peripherally are also going to deteriorate. You can't improve the aviation system except as part of the transportation system, and that's got to accompany some rectification of our use of energy. And until we get some broad public awareness that there are big troubles here that we have to fix, nobody's going to articulate a new policy.
And in that debate, you'd have to have not only the regulation, deregulation debate, you'd have to have what are the policy outcomes for each of those? What do we want?
It's much more than just a regulation, deregulation debate. I think the point that I would simply make is that deregulation, whether it's of aviation, of energy, of finance, whatever, so it makes the presumption, the Adam Smith presumption, that the invisible hand of self-interest will always guide individuals and companies towards the best outcome. That is not so. The world is too complicated. We need some level of regulation in most activities where what you do can affect others, and virtually everything we do today can affect others.
That argues also that there isn't anything we can do in the aviation discussion without considering the global aviation system.
I think you can certainly dwell on the issues of the domestic system independently of a consideration of the international system. But the reality is, right, that to have a truly vigorous domestic aviation system, U.S. airlines have to play a major role in international aviation. And that isn't going to happen unless we strengthen the domestic system.
So that's that's a very important argument, that if you're only focused on price and the service deteriorates and the fleet deteriorates and the routes deteriorate, you can't compete internationally.
Exactly right. And in today, U.S. airlines cannot compete. I mean, go look at the list of the world's 10 best airlines. There's not a U.S. carrier that's anywhere near it.
That goes back to where we began this conversation, this hour, code sharing. Do we then have to link up with other airlines that are stronger than us, or have them have international financing for our airlines?
Well,
Is
and
that
you can certainly go there. Where did we start? We started with strong U.S. airlines, on which others were required to depend.
right?
We've had 30 years of unsuccessful, stupid policy. Today we have very weak U.S. airlines now dependent on others. And if we want to add into that toxic mix, letting those others now buy our airlines, we'll get a still worse outcome.
I think you've hit the elements of the current debate in this question of the last 30 years of deregulation, and we do seem to be on the cusp of a new debate. You note that it hasn't really started, at least in terms of transportation policy.
That's
but
right.
What do you see coming? I mean, we have a new Secretary of Transportation. We have a new president. We have the legislation that's coming up, the FAA reauthorization.
But it's not coming up, you see. Therein lies the key. Yes, we have a new president, and I was a great supporter of Obama, so I was glad to see him get elected. But the reality is I've been very disappointed in his performance, been very disappointed in his appointment of Ray LaHood. Not because LaHood's a bad guy, but because LaHood doesn't have a background in transportation and doesn't seem to have any consuming interest in transportation. And I've been disappointed by the congressional indifference to aviation because the Reauthorization Act isn't going to happen. It's going to be extended again. And we're now in the third year of extensions, I think. It's been several years, at least 2 years, since there's been a real aviation authorization. It's just simply gotten extended, and that extension imposes a whole variety of limitations on the FAA. There's some things they can't do in an extension period that they could do with a real reauthorization. So I don't see much hope here. I mean, the fact is that there are enormous problems out there. We are terribly preoccupied with this healthcare thing, which is certainly important. On the other hand, I'm not sure that in the long run it's any more important than the energy policy. I'm not sure it's any more important in the long run than a coherent transportation policy. Right. So it is the issue du jour, but we've got a lot of big issues. And aviation doesn't rise to that level, but the fact is aviation is an important component of the transportation problem, and that is a major problem and has to be dealt with concurrently with the energy problem.
And the reauthorization or authorization of the FAA, is there an industry support for this? What does the industry want to do?
Absolutely. The industry has advocated reauthorization as strongly as it can, but the fact is, because it keeps getting delayed because of sub-arguments. How shall we finance the Aviation Trust Fund? There's this raging argument between private aviation and commercial aviation. Most of the money is raised today with excise taxes. Right? There's a lot of sentiment within, and has been for many years, within the commercial industry, which says, wait a minute, this is not an appropriate way to do this because it does not result in having those who use the airspace resources administered by the FAA. It doesn't allocate costs in the same way that costs get allocated in the European systems, where you pay fees. Right. But in European systems and in Asia, you don't have anything like as vibrant a general aviation component as you have in the United States. There are thousands and thousands of pilots and small airplanes in the U.S. that doesn't exist elsewhere. So the fact of the matter is that's a politically potent force. The consequence is the imposition of fees, user fees, as opposed to excise taxes, is a very contentious issue which has slowed down the whole business of reauthorization. And it is one of those issues. And at the same time, the the government, because of its budgetary problems, doesn't want to allocate money to aviation out of the general fund. So you got the government sort of trying to move away from financing aviation. You've got the commercial airlines saying, wait a minute, we pay more than we should. You've got general aviation saying, wait a minute, we don't need another big bureaucracy that's going to send us a bill every time we take off in our airplane. So you've got all those forces of contention within the aviation industry, which has certainly slowed down reauthorization because this argument between the carriers and private aviation arises every time there is a new authorization. Commercial aviation tries to get general aviation to pay more. General aviation resists. General aviation is politically more powerful than commercial aviation. Mm-hmm. Finally, right, the commercial aviation industry loses and we get reauthorization. They ought to give up.
That dynamic is
You're not going to win. And the fact is you're probably not going to succeed in imposing a fee-for-service system on the aviation infrastructure in the United States. It isn't going to happen. It's not to say it shouldn't. It probably should. And the operation of the air traffic control system ought to come out of the FAA and be put into a public-private partnership, as has been done in virtually every other country in the world, with very good success. But that, too, is very contentious because the controllers union doesn't want to see it happen. Because it is always easier for the controllers union to get a big increase out of Congress than it would be out of an investor-owned utility. And the consequence is that probably isn't going to happen either. But simply not passing reauthorization isn't an appropriate way to deal with all of this. You've got to have some leadership. You've got to call these people together. You've got to say, fellas, we're going into the room and we're not coming out till we got a deal. I'm going to give you a little of what you want. I'm going to give you a little of what you want. Give you guys a little of what you want, but we're going to come out of here with a system where we can reauthorize and where we've got the mechanism to put a new air traffic control system in place, which is what we need.
We're going to take a break for a few minutes, but I'd like to come back to air traffic control and the future when we come back.
Okay, good
Thank you
deal.
again.